like fanfiction. I have liked fan fictions that have no plot to speak of, weird off-the-wall characterizations, paper-thin original characters, no themes or heavy-handed messages, and that's all fine. I don't read fan fiction for the writing quality. I read it because they're fun. They are the purest form of a guilty pleasure, and the Shambling Guide series scratches that same itch. Don't get me wrong, the Shambling Guide series isn't bad. It's not going to win any super prestigious writing awards, but they're good books. They're tropey, the writing gets clunky every once in a while, and the characters are a little old to have such a YA romance. Seriously, the love interest turns into a vampire. But they are so fun.
So fun.
With that said, I overlook certain things in fan fiction. I've read stories that don't have any punctuation to speak of, that are just one block of text because apparently the author had a vendetta against making new paragraphs. I've read plenty of works with footnotes saying, sorry for the errors, English isn't my first language, that are impeccably written, and stories that have such atrocious errors, only a native English speaker could mess up our language that bad. And I have come across plenty of fan fictions that are great that just stop. Sometimes the author tells us the story is abandoned, sometimes you don't realize it until you get to the last chapter and realize the story hasn't been updated since 2008. And again, that's fine. That's fan fiction. These authors are doing this for fun. Their work isn't being sent to an editor or a lot of times even a beta reader, and they're not being paid for their work.
Where's my money?
The Shambling Guide series, though, was published. The author did make money off these. I had higher expectations of this work. So to finish the second book, which ends leading up to another book, and to check and see when that book will come out, only to realize these books were published in 2014 was... I have been personally victimized by Mur Lafferty.
I've ever felt personally victimized by Regina George.
Let's talk about my biggest disappointment of 2024, The Shambling Guide to New York City, and its sequel, The Ghost Train to New Orleans by Mur Lafferty. Now, I haven't decided how I want to handle reviews of book series yet, if I want to make each book its own video or lump them all together, but since this is just 2 books, I've decided to give each book its own video. So let's start with the first book, The Shambling Guide to New York City.
Time's a charm.
The Shambling Guide to New York City follows Zoe, a woman who just moved to New York looking for a fresh start, and part of that fresh start means finding a job. The book starts with Zoe in a bookshop worried about how she's going to pay rent, until she spots a man, Phil, hanging up a help wanted sign. He and the bookstore employee tell Zoe she's not right for the job. She's not the right kind of people, but she insists and manages to get an interview. And over again for the first 8 chapters of the book, Zoe gets ready for her interview and just keeps getting told by Phil and his employees and the people he introduces Zoe to that she's not right for the job. Until finally Phil takes Zoe out for dinner where she learns she's not right because Phil is a vampire and all his employees are monsters, or coterie as the book calls them. There are dragons and zombies and nymphs and gods and goddesses. Basically every magical creature humanity's ever thought of exists, and because they feed off humans in one way or another, they have a lot to gain by just keeping their heads down and coexisting with humans in secret. And Zoe accepts that and gets the job.
Wild human! Wild human!
And as Zoe gets settled into her new job, she learns a lot about how this world works, how the coterie feed off people, how they hide in plain sight, and in the underground, like the sewers. And she meets a lot of coterie, as well as Granny Goodmay, a human woman who teaches Zoe to defend herself against co-workers who want to eat her. She also meets her neighbor Arthur, who works for Public Works. Those are the sewer workers, and they're also basically the human police for the coterie.
It's the police!
I ain't no police!
And while Zoe's learning all this, shenanigans begin. Zoe's just a few days into her new job when she's introduced to their new HR person, who is a construct, basically a Frankenstein's monster made partially out of her ex-boyfriend. This raises some eyebrows, but they keep trekking along until someone starts messing with the zombies. That's right, zombies again. There's no escape. First, they steal food from the zombies and poison it. Then more and more zombies get poisoned and start turning into the mindless, man-eating creatures they're portrayed as. And it's right about this point that we also discover that Zoe didn't just move to New York to try and make it. She was actually escaping the scandal of being her boss's mistress. And wouldn't you know it, it's his wife, Lucy, who's messing with the city's coterie, and Zoe. As it turns out, she's a zoetist, who's basically a human coterie. They're magical people, and she wants to take control of New York City, and also destroy Zoe. So they do what they can to team up with Public Works and try to contain the chaos that's coming and figure out how to stop Lucy.
Catfight?
Sorry, Todd.
And the climax of the book is them going to intercept Lucy at the airport, where she makes a golem who attacks their group and the airport. Then she escapes to Central Park, where she tries to contain the soul of the city in her golem. And this is where we learn another fun fact about Zoe. As the book goes on, she's more and more been hearing voices in her head. But when you're working with monsters, that's not too much of a red flag. But she learns that she's also a zoetist too, and so is Granny Goodmay, and they're city talkers. They can talk to the soul of the city, and Granny Goodmay ends up sacrificing herself to save the city, body and soul. And after that, they managed to kill Lucy, and although it was a big attack that took a lot of lives, they still stopped the worst of it, and things returned back to a semblance of normalcy. And the book ends with Zoe talking to her love interest Arthur about how she has a new work assignment to go to New Orleans.
New Orleans!
There are 3 parts of the book that make me prickle. The biggest one is the inclusion of incubus and succubus, sex demons, specifically John, who is one of Zoe's coworkers and who constantly tries to seduce her. Look, I'll admit, I'm a prude, but even if I weren't, I'm still off-put reading about Zoe working and having her coworker constantly flirt with her even when she tells him to stop, and knowing there's no recourse for this. And the book portrays incubus and succubus as the equivalent of a drug. John keeps talking about how everything he does is consensual, but he constantly touches Zoe without permission. And when he has her cornered, he has a physical impact on her by nature of being a demon that makes it feel like you're reading someone getting roofied. It's gross, and honestly, when I reread the book, I ended up just skipping over the parts with John, and the only saving grace for the series is that he's not in the second book.
Don't touch me. Help!
The other thing that was a lot was the book talking about 9/11. Zoe's job is as a travel writer, and the book takes place in New York in the 2010s. The climax starts with an airport attack. There are some things that you have to include, but it's so jarring having it brought up, especially when they wrap it up in the context of the urban fantasy and talk about how the real world tragedy affects the fictional creatures. And mind you, I'm coming at this as a Gen Zer. I don't remember 9/11. I can't imagine how much more jarring it would be to read this slant on the tragedy as someone who remembers it. And this is something to be wary of as a writer. When you're talking about real-world beliefs or events, or especially tragedies, first, don't appropriate someone else's culture. And do research, get first-hand accounts of what you want to include, and get a sensitivity reader. It's so easy to get this wrong, and I have no idea if Mur Lafferty did, so you have to do your own research here.
Google it.
No.
And the last thing that made me prickle was the romance. I like Arthur, but he's not a very big character in either book, and he definitely in the first book falls into the "don't go, I must protect you" trope. And I personally hate that trope of someone, usually a man, telling the female protagonist that something's too dangerous for her. Plus, these characters are in their 30s. It's one thing to not have your stuff together when you're a teenager. It's less forgivable when you're middle-aged.
I'm old, so I'm the victim.
With all that said, though, as I said, this book is so fun. There is a ton of really good and immersive world building in this book that is so much fun, and Mur Lafferty does it in a really good way that explains a lot without answering too many questions, without it ever feeling info dumpy. The characters of the book are also really fun. There's a lot of them, and a lot of the characters are different creatures, and they also have big personalities. It sort of feels like an anime where everyone has their wild hair, and they're constantly yelling about what's important to them. And say what you want about anime, but people like them, and I can probably name a dozen anime protagonists off the top of my head. They're fun, and if you want to write fun, memorable, likable, or even unlikable characters, this book is a great read. So go and read the Shambling Guide to New York City, and come back next month for the follow-up video on the Ghost Train to New Orleans.